So the heresy that we are discussing today in the second of 4 credo courses on the heresies of the church is Donatism. And as I said this morning in worship, it is my favorite heresy, and I hope it will be yours too by the time we're done. Werner last week gave a very good definition of heresy, and I just want to kind of go back over kind of a basic understanding of what heresy is. Heresy comes from the Greek eresis, which means a choice, a thing chosen. So a heresy is a choice that the church over time has decided is a wrong choice. But before they get there, there's usually a lot of debate. Like, a heresy is interesting to church historians and to people of faith because it's not just a crazy out there idea. It's an idea that gets a lot of good discussion going in the church itself. And most people that were actually branded heretics were themselves trying to push the church toward truth. They really believed that the idea that they had was a true reflection of Christian tradition and thought. And so I want you to have a little bit of sympathy, and we'll get to that more as we go along. I want you to have a little sympathy for the heretics because of the notion that they really were trying to do something that they thought was about the truth of the faith. So it's not a silly idea. Ultimately, the church, though, decides that a heresy is an idea that would reduce a tension or mystery central to the faith, a tension or a mystery. And we'll get at that in a minute, but usually the most interesting places within Christian theology are where there's some sort of tension. All right. So one of my church history professors used this phrase. He said, "Choose your heresies wisely," and he said that because, one, he basically believed that everybody is heretical in some aspect of their thought and belief, so nobody's perfect. And he also said that because he thought when you're choosing a heresy, when you think about heresies, there are aspects of it that you gravitate toward and that illumine parts of your faith. When I was in seminary, some friends and I, we created a fake television show that was based on What's My Line, and we would have people, we had a panel of us blindfolded, and we'd bring somebody in and they would just start talking about their faith. And then at a certain point, somebody would ring the buzzer or the bell in front of them and say, "Stop, that's heresy." And we called it the That's Heresy Show, and we made a number of versions of this fake TV show that were shown in order to identify heresies. So we're going to play That's Heresy Show, and we're going to work our way toward it in relationship to Donatism. But before we get to Donatism and its founder, a guy whose name was Donatus, not Donut, but Donat, we're going to start with Diocletian, the Roman emperor, from 284 to 305. And Diocletian is a very significant Roman emperor for the study of the early church because he was a military commander, he was founder and part of the Tetrarchy, and somewhere back in your heads you will remember your Roman history class that there was a time when the Roman Empire was divided up into 4 pieces. That was Diocletian's idea. He said the Roman Empire has gotten too big And in order to manage it, we need to have basically 4 different Caesars, not one. And so Diocletian was the one who imagined this happening. And so you can see here, this is kind of color-coded the 4 parts of the tetrarchy. So everything that's in the yellow, the green, the pink, and the kind of purpley mauve color, that's the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire in around 300 extends all the way up Great Britain to Hadrian's Wall. Anybody here been to Hadrian's Wall? Yes. Good. You know, so that was because they could get only so far, but then the Scots said no more. So the Scots, they're like, we're not going up. Those people are crazy up there. We're not going to put Hadrian's Wall across. So the Roman Empire extended to Hadrian's Wall in the north part of Great Britain. It extended down through Spain into northern Africa. It extended across here to Egypt and to the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, and then, of course, most of Turkey, and then up into what is modern-day Greece, Italy, of course, at the heart of the Roman Empire. The 4 areas then are this one here, the mauve one, which is Turkey, the Holy Land, northern Egypt. That's where Diocletian is in control. So that's an interesting thing about him, is that he said it needs to be divided up into 4. And so he was really giving up some power to say, I'm just going to be in control of this area. On the other hand, he gave the most important area, which is Italy and Rome and northern Africa and Spain, to his son, Maximian. And so the father and the son control those 2 areas. And then the pink area here, modern Greece, was to Galerius, who was a commander with Diocletian. And then the yellow area went to Constantius. Constantius is going to be very significant for us because Constantius is the father of Constantine the Great. Great. We're going to get to that in just a moment. Okay, so Diocletian. Basically, Christians would say that Diocletian was the worst of the persecuting Roman emperors. Now, there are other wackos. Nero was insane and did not burn Christians. Caligula, not good. But Diocletian wasn't nearly as crazy as those 2 I just mentioned, but he was much more efficient in his persecution, and he legalized the persecution of Christians. Why did he do that? Well, Diocletian was a religious conservative. Now, what does that mean? Why is he persecuting Christians? Because Christians are the newcomers. They're the crazy cult. And Diocletian is a traditionalist in terms of he believes in the Roman pantheon. All right? Apollo is the main god, according to Diocletian. And he was very big into having ritual. There were always pantheistic priests, in and around Diocletian's homes, and he would have them regularly do animal sacrifices where they would take animals, they would kill them, and then they would pull their entrails out and then throw them in the air and let them fall on the floor, and then they would study them to see what kind of future they could see in them. So this was happening, and Diocletian was getting kind of annoyed with these priests because they weren't really giving him any helpful information. And he's like, what's the matter with you guys? And they said, well, we have a problem. And they said, well, what's the problem? He said, the problem is it's the Christians. There are Christians in your household. There are people here who are believing in this Jesus, who are working for you, who are in like the kitchen and who are in the stables and who are sewing leather items, downstairs. These Christians, they're bringing these impure beliefs into your home. And that's why we can't see the future anymore in the animal intestines that we're looking at. Now, that sounds kind of crazy to you and me, but to Diocletian, he's like, well, what do we do? And they say, well, it's easy. You got to get rid of the Christians. The pagan priests under Diocletian blamed Christians for messing up their attempts to divine the future, and they especially blamed this guy, Romanus, who was a popular preacher of Jesus and who was critical of pagan rituals. And they said that's the first one that has to go is Romanus. And so Diocletian took this guy who was a popular preacher, had him brought into the palace, and they pulled his tongue out, and then they chopped his head off. He's one of the first martyrs under Diocletian was this guy here, Saint Romanus. So that was the beginning of Diocletian's persecutions, but right around the time that he was getting sensitive and his priests were sensitive to the growing popularity of Christianity. And see, the interesting thing is that in Roman Empire, the top guys are staying more or less connected with pagan religion, but the common people are getting more and more interested in this Jesus fellow. And so that's one of the things, you've got this nervousness by the pagan priests. They're like, something's got to be done about this. And it was around that time that in Rome, there was a fire in the palace. And this is right there in the historical records, right? In the late 200s, there's this fire in the palace in Rome. And the priests blame it on the Christians. They say it's the Christians. They're setting things on fire in order to take you down. And so it was at that point that he issues in 303 an edict against the Christians, and he makes Christianity illegal. And he requires that anybody in that entire empire, right? That's a big area. Anybody in all of the Roman Empire who has a copy of the Christian scriptures must hand them over to the local magistrate. And it's now illegal going forward for Christians to assemble at all, to talk, to worship, to have an educational class. He makes it illegal for Christians to assemble. And in the early 300s, then he also said being a leader of a Christian community is punishable by death. And so across the Roman Empire, but especially in Diocletian's region, 3,000 Christian bishops and clergy are killed, all in the early 300s. So this is we're working our way toward the heresy here. So you can look at this realm. Here's the realm now. Christianity is illegal. Christian leaders are being killed. And people are handing over their copies of Scripture. They're also handing over other things like, a chalice that would be used for communion. Here, this is one of our holy options. They're actually they had baptismal fonts. They're wheeling those out in the street and smashing them, made out of stones. And as that's occurring, and most of that's occurring here in this part, but the ripple effects are going out there. There's resistance too. And most of the resistance is happening kind of in this no man's land area here and up here, Hippo and Carthage. And we're going to come back to that momentarily. the Christian communities that exist come up with a name for those who turn over their scriptures, who recant the faith. And the name is a traditore, which means to give up, to hand over. And that is the root of our contemporary word, traitor. Exactly. Traditore is, if you look up in the dictionary, it will tell you it comes from the Latin, traitor comes from the Latin traditore. And traditores were people who gave up the scriptures, sacred vessels, or the names of brethren. So it's like, Nancy Moore, she's got a baptismal font in her back room that she's hiding until this goes away. You might want to know that. Then they come in and they find the baptismal font, and then they take Nancy Moore out into the public square and they chop her head off. So it's bad. It's really bad in the early 300s. But it switched, it flipped. This is one of the most acute, sudden, wild, historical about-faces in human history. Constantine the Great comes, he conquers, he unifies again the Roman Empire. He comes to power, and what's Constantine's big story about when he's about to conquer? Anybody know? What does he see in the sky? He has a dream. He sees, Tony's got it. He sees a cross in the sky. By this sign you will conquer. And Constantine decides to become Christian. This is the big about face and change. Now, historians have different, some like the story of the dream and the cross, but others say Constantine was no dummy. He realized that Christianity was fast becoming the religion of the common people, and that he viewed what Diocletian had done as stupid, as politically bad, and as increasing the tension in the empire. And the way to bring the empire together was to unify it. So you go from, right? This is in a less than 10-year span. You go from an emperor who declares Christianity to be illegal and worship of it punishable by death, to the Edict of Milan in 313, which established toleration for Christianity within the Roman Empire, and then Constantine himself basically letting it known that this was his faith. And so all these people are flip-flopping and changing their religion, and so now this brings us to the traditores. So now the question is, what happens to those people, like Dale Hansen, who turned Nancy Moore in? Because I found out it was Dale who told the last group that she had that baptismal font in her back room. What happens to Dale now? Okay. Well, the rest of us are not so happy with Dale because we kind of liked Nancy, and he turned her in, and her head got chopped off, and she used to make this really great smoked salmon dip, and we don't get that anymore, and so now we're mad at Dale.
Wait, but Christianity is about forgiveness.
Well, hang on to that. We'll come back. All right, so Christianity now is the emperor's favorite religion, and the question of what to do with the people like Dale is in the water. What do we do with the traditores? And the basic thing is, well, they took the easy path during the persecution. Others suffered. Their lives were lost. And at the same time, you've got a lot of political opportunists who are like, okay, Constantine's Christian. This is the way to get into power, is to be Christian. And who had power in addition to the military leaders, but the local religious leaders? So you had people like Dale suddenly saying, I'd like to be bishop. And people saying, wait a minute, didn't you turn Nancy Moore in? And this is where our friend Donatus is going to come into play. Because Donatus, who we're not exactly sure when he was born. We know he died about 355, so I've got a circa on there. Donatus, who lived in North Africa and around the Carthage area, Donatus was a hardliner in regard to the traditores. Donatus said, Dale can never, ever, ever again do anything in the church. But not only that, but anything that Dale has done in the church didn't count. So if Dale baptized your baby, no, that was no good, because Dale was obviously a traditor. He didn't really have the faith in him. If Dale presided at your wedding, no, it was no good, because he was a traditor. If Dale put a blessing on you at your funeral, no, it was no good. Nothing that Dale did as a Christian was any good, said Donatus. So Donatus is a rigorist. He said the church is made up of saints, not sinners like Dale, all right? And so only the saints are the ones who we really want to have power and authority in the church. The true church should not be tainted by these backsliders, these people that were willing at the drop of a hat to work with Rome, because you know what? If things flipped again, they'd do it again. Look at Dale. He's just waiting to turn Genie in the next time there's a new emperor. All right? So, the only sacraments that are legit, efficacious, they carry with them the grace of God, are sacraments that were performed by priests who were not traditores. And so that means you've got to go back over the last 10, 15 years or so. Any of the sacraments that were done by traditory clergy, they need to be redone. So if you're baptized by Dale, you better come and be baptized by me. That's what Donatus says. Not only that, but Donatus works and he gets Felix, the bishop of Carthage, thrown out. He says, this guy's a carpetbagger. And I suspect him, they never had evidence, I suspect him of being a traditore. And so Donatus had Felix tossed out as bishop. Donatus is an extremely powerful figure for a brief amount of time in North Africa. And all the stuff that he declared, the church has said, and that's heresy. Now, why? Let's just talk together a little bit here. Why do you think the church might ultimately conclude that what Donatus was saying is wrong?
Because if one of the traditores is blessing someone or marrying something, it's really the Holy Spirit that's committed.
A lot of people nodding behind you. Yes. Good. So David is saying it's not the person of the priest, it's the activity of God. Good. Good theological instinct. Nancy, whose head has been magically reattached.
Well, sinners, the church is for sinners. So we must include sinners and not only saints.
So that's really interesting. I want us to talk about that for a little bit. The church is for sinners. Do you believe that?
Yes. But should it be led by sinners?
Should it be led by sinners?
It is led by
But, good question, how much sin? How much sin would you tolerate me getting into? I'm serious. I think that there's a line that I could cross where you would all say, Right?
level, you're out.
Okay. Trump level sin. What? Yeah, all the way in the back there. Isn't everybody a sinner? Yes, the church would say. But are all sins the same? No, most people don't think so. This is where it gets interesting, right? Remember I said the thing about heresies, it's not like it's a crazy idea. Donatus is pushing on something here, which is really a question of how tainted will you accept? How much taint will you accept in a leader? Joel, how much taint will you accept in a leader?
Well, it goes back to you can't have someone in an organization who is against the mission of that organization.
So that's an interesting comment. How much, is the person's taint just sort of, it's more than a quirk, but is it something that is not actively working against the mission of the organization? That's good. So Donatism is in a very interesting place, right? You starting to see why this is a cool heresy? Because it makes you think about stuff that's hard. All right. How are we doing on time? Is there a clock? I have no idea what time it is.
12:55.
All right. So what are the implications of the teachings that Donatus put out there? As I've already said, those baptized by the Traditori clergy were told they needed to be rebaptized. The sacrament of confession and penance was called into question. This is really interesting, right? So within the Catholic Church, in the 7 sacraments, confession and penance is one of those 7 sacraments. And the notion is, every time I say sacrament, you have to say grace of God is somehow involved, right? And so we know what the grace of God is involved in the baptism, in the marriage, but in confession and penance, the grace of God is in the person saying, all right, I did this, and the priest saying, you're forgiven. That's the grace of God. Now, go and do, 27 Hail Marys and serve at the local soup kitchen for the next 6 months on every Tuesday evening. That's penance. That's the forgiveness becoming realized in your life. That's a sacrament. But if you're Donatus, you don't think that that's such a good idea anymore. You don't think that Dale can just confess, yeah, it's true. I told them that Nancy had a baptismal font, and they cut her head off, and I felt bad about it for a while. And the priest can say, Dale, you've got to do a lot of soup kitchen work for that, but you are forgiven. Well, Porter over there, who's really good friends to Nancy, is like, I'm not so sure. Right? It's challenging. This whole somebody else gets to forgive him for something that, was done to my friend. And so it's a hard moment in the faith. And so confession and penance, there's a question that Donatus has as to whether there are certain sins that stain us and permanently make us unable to go on in ministry. If you don't think the church still deals with this, look at the Roman Catholic Church and what's been going on in terms of sexual abuse. So, and a lot of the criticism is about forgiving or moving or turning a blind eye. And so, then this question here, and this question was something, David, I think it came through in your first comment out of the gate, which was really a good one. If the sacraments and the teachings of clergy are solid only if performed by non-compromised clergy, then how much compromise is too much? So, Jonah and Werner and I stood at the table, broke the bread, blessed the cup. What if I got in an argument with Amy yesterday? Did that mess with that moment? Or not? How much? How pure do your clergy have to be in order for the sacraments to be good, in order for God's grace to flow? Enter into the conversation St. Augustine. This is one of the things I think is really cool about heresies. Heresies almost always stir up a theological conversation that leads to a saint. St. Augustine. St. Augustine made his medal fighting Donatism. And Augustine is fascinating in this, and I want to talk about that. But the first thing I want to do is to look at Charles André van Loo's painting from 1750. And this is supposed to be Augustine here, the younger fellow arguing with Donatus over here about all the stuff that we've been talking about. Now, there's a couple of problems with this painting. Anybody catch what it was? I kind of slipped it by you fast, but thank you. Very good. You see, you are paying attention. Augustine was only a year old when Donatus died. So Augustine and Donatus never debated each other. What happened was Donatus's ideas grabbed hold around the Roman Empire, but especially in North Africa. And so Augustine spent his time, when he later comes to prominence, debating with Donatists, people who followed the teachings of Donatus. So good, that was really good. That was the hard one. The other one, it's a little easier, but you have to be paying attention to where these folk are from. What else is wrong with this painting? These are white guys. And Donatus and Augustine were both Africans. And a lot of people think that Augustine probably looked more like this. Born in 354, a year before Donatus dies. Augustine is the notorious bad boy of Christian theologians. So what better person to fight Donatism than somebody who was known for his profligate ways? If there's anybody in Christian theology who's the prodigal son, it's Augustine. Augustine was just like, he's the guy who notoriously prayed, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." That's true. That's true. His mother, Monica, about wore out her knees praying for this boy. She was a firm Christian believer and who kept trying to draw him back toward the faith. And eventually it worked. At the age of 31, after he had been involved in thievery and wild living, this really was the party boy of Carthage. Augustine converts, and he writes a book called Confessions, interestingly enough. Now, why is that interesting when we're talking about Donatism? Because he writes a spiritual autobiography that details all of his sins from early on, just goes through. That's his book. He's like, all this and still God. And that's a very powerful, influential thing for all sorts of people in the ancient world, is Augustine's autobiography and story of how he came to faith. It brings many other people to faith. So that brings us just to this whole question that then Augustine raises. He's like, okay, and this is exactly what bullet point number 1, David, I'll give you this entirely. That's it. It depends not on the moral state. A sacrament depends not on the moral state of a clergy person. Doesn't matter whether I had an argument with Amy, but on the activity of God. That's where the power of the sacrament lies in that. And so you don't need to rebaptize because God was still there. And if you get into the whole thing of, it's just we're going to spend all of our time going, oh, but you did this and you did that, it's just, no. This is about God's activity. The one who officiates, this is something Augustine said, the one who really officiates, and you can hear this in our communion prayers. The host at the table is Christ. It's not me. It's not Scott's table. It's not Werner's table. It's not Jonah's table. It's not Sarah's table. It's Christ's table. The one who officiates at the baptism is Christ. And then finally, of course, Augustine points out, because it's his story too, that redemption is at the heart of our faith story, and that Donatism, in order to exist, it has to reject a core message of the New Testament, like stories like the parable of the prodigal son, which the father doesn't, not only does he not reject the prodigal son, he runs to the prodigal son. And so Augustine said, not only is Donatism wrong, but it's completely the opposite of what God's impulse is, which is to embrace the one who is engaged in profligate ways. So Donatism it keeps cropping up in the Christian faith. So, I've already told you the story about this community's back struggle with it. It's there in the arts too, and I used to make a practice of reading. I've got too much to read, but I used to read The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene every single year, and I used to recommend that to other clergy because how many of you have read that? So this is a really important book. You should read it at some point in your life. It's the story of a whiskey priest, an alcoholic priest in Mexico. And he is, and it's during a time of persecutions. It's written during a time of persecutions, anti-Catholicism in Mexico, that Graham Greene writes this story. The whiskey priest is being hunted by the government of his time, and still he's traveling around from village to village, and he's celebrating communion quietly at night in little huts and stuff. The issue with it all is the priest struggles every step of the way because he considers himself to be a mortal sinner. And why does he consider himself to be a mortal sinner? This is spoiler alert, but are you really going to go read it like tomorrow? Because he's fathered a child with a woman in one of the villages. And the priest believes that his mortal sin is not just that he fathered the child, but that he loves the child. All right? So that's the story. It's an incredible novel about this priest. But his struggle all the way along, his personal struggle, and the struggle of others, because eventually somebody betrays him to the government, and this is the big spoiler alert, he doesn't make it alive out of the end of the novel. The big question is, all the way through, is he's doing these acts, these pastoral acts, feeding people the body and blood of Christ. And is that legit because he's tainted by his own sin? It's Donatism, and it's in one of the most famous works of literature in the 20th century. Powerful, powerful book. But Donatism is also in the news. How many of you saw this story? This comes from back in February. This is a screenshot that I pulled right out of the New York Times. Pastor resigns after incorrectly performing thousands of baptisms. The pastor of a Catholic church in Phoenix changed one word in administering the sacrament, rendering baptisms performed there invalid. What was the word he changed? What was his big error? He said, "We baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," instead of "I baptize you." And the local bishop said that makes the baptisms invalid. And my first thought was, on reading this story in the New York Times, was, Donatism! Because what is the core import in the sacrament of baptism? How did that stop the activity of the Holy Spirit? No. And it's not. That's just not a Protestant versus Catholic thing. It's within the Catholic faith itself. Is that this is, you cannot put that much on the priests. They declared thousands of baptisms, and he's been going back around trying to redo them. Poor guy. So he had to quit his job, but then they sent him around to redo them the right way, as if somehow those people weren't on God's radar screen because he'd gotten one word wrong. So why does Donatism still matter? Why is it still important? Why do I hope you've already gotten a sense of why I think it's important. I think underneath our endeavor as Christian community, there's always the question, how can flawed people be about the work of God? We're all flawed. Does that mean, and a lot of people are like, I laugh because it's like a famous thing is to accuse Christians, churches of being hypocritical. But we're all hypocrites in one way or another. We really are. And so, is it possible to still do good as an imperfect soul? And I think Augustine says, yeah. His whole life testifies, yeah. What are the standards that we use to determine what is true and good and faithful? Those are still challenges for Christians, and we talk about them, we debate them a lot. That's why heresies are not always they're not so simple slam dunks, oh, of course that's wrong. And can human error really stand in the way of God's activity and God's blessing? On that, I think the answer is no. I don't think that human error can prevent the activity of God. And I think human error can bother us a lot. But it doesn't stop God. It never has. So, that's it. That's Donatism. Any questions?